Hi, this is Paul. As I mentioned yesterday, there's a really interesting tweet from November 17, that Bret Weinstein put out, which I want to spend a little bit more time on because it just got me thinking, which is why I do the videos that I do. So I'm just going to start reading the tweet. The New Testament is a major revision of an ancient cultural operating system. The updated code is fundamental to the modern West, which inevitably crashes without it. Some who have retained the trappings of the prior version of the OS have quietly accepted the fundamentals of the updated system. Jews who adhere to the Golden Rule and don't believe in collective punishment, as are an example. We are compatible with the West and do well in it without needing or wanting to rig the system in our favor. We want a level playing field, but obviously many American Jews are not of this mindset. The Golden Rule believing Jews, it is galling to be lumped in with those threatening the West by endlessly attempting to rig the system. Some populations who initially apply the update, self-described Christians, are now applying patches that revert the core OS back to the pre-updated status. They are explicitly inclined to rig the system in favor of their lineage, despite being a distinctly unchristian thing to do. White nationalist Christians are an example of this. It is an Old Testament mindset with Christian aesthetics and rhetoric. Now, I know that there's a ton of political chaff around this in terms of woke, anti-woke, reverse racism, colorblindness, all of those different things. But I thought that the tweet was incredibly interesting given the conversation and sort of failure to really meet each other that, has continued to happen between Jonathan Peugeot and Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein, way back sort of in the IDW days, would usually talk about religion as as reading old code, and the old code needs to get updated, but religion isn't sufficiently updating the code. And in the earlier days of making videos, I talked quite a bit about this, interacted more with Bret's work on this. And it seems that he's really changed his take on religion. Okay, it was this video that he did. It was basically talking about, way back in the IDW days, we talked about sense making, and now the whole sense making thing has become a little bit more of a crisis. I'm waiting for a glass guy I gotta answer the phone. Last week, someone decided they wanted to take a look in the classrooms, which pretty much hold Sunday school material, old tables and chairs, and some old furniture we're trying to get rid of. And they hauled all the bunch of the furniture out and broke a bunch of windows to discover there's nothing of value at all in those places. And so now I have to have a glass guy out and fix the glass, and probably cost about $1,000 for this person to go through a bunch of classrooms to discover there's nothing worth here stealing. I just want to put up a sign and maybe leave the doors unlocked, except then I'd have a whole bunch of people living in those classrooms. Anyway, the guy will be here in 10 minutes. I'll have to pause then. Hopefully it's not too incoherent. Anyway, Bret has sort of changed his tune on religion and noticed, along with a great many other people over the last 8 years, the utility of religions, instead of sort of being a little bit down on it, saying, well, the problem with religions is they run old code and they don't update their code. The argument I made back then was, in fact, religions are constantly updating their code. That's the work of theology. That's what religions do all the time as a community, in continuity with people in the past. And with the sense-making crisis, sort of knowledge crisis, he noted that, wow, religious people, that's probably why religions stay around, because everybody, in fact, does have to make sense of the world and does have to figure it out.
Know what a plausible creature looks like, and it will be able to therefore create creatures that if you don't actually have experience with them, you wouldn't know one way or the other. So, point is, that is going to create, first, a radical increase in the rate of proliferation of cognitive universes that we are forced to keep alive. And I suspect that the immediate consequence of that is going to be...
Now, part of this is the fact that religions are extremely adept at the creation and curation of cognitive universes. That's in many ways what religion is, because religion helps us function in terms of that which is highest or that which is sacred, and then how to get there. That's what religions do. And everyone within that definition of religion has a functional religion, because human beings, a la the frame problem, need to reduce the world down to a manageable thing in order to know how to get through it. And you can go look at all the work done by Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, Ian McGilchrist, all of the work over the last 10 years in terms of cognitive science to understand what we actually do in order to live productively in this world involves that reduction of the combinatorial explosiveness of the world down to a manageable set of things in order to work. And what that tends to do is create all of these little side-by-side cognitive worlds that live next to each other to one degree or another in competition with each other. But if they can come into productive conversation with one another, can actually continue to make progress towards a better knowing of the world. Now, some of you will listen to that and say, "Oh, that sounds basically like they're all starting from an equal place." I would not say that. All of us start from a place of struggle. I'm not a perennialist that's like, well, all religions are sort of, no. I wouldn't say that at all. Some are right, some are wrong. Most religions get at least a little something right. In fact, if they get almost everything wrong, because otherwise they wouldn't survive if they got absolutely nothing right. But at the same time, you can't just sort of inhabit all of the religions or look at the least common denominator, and that tends to be what most perennialist approaches tend to do. No, you really have to inhabit one and live in one and believe within one. In fact, all of us do. And all of our big R religious schema involve a combination of all of the sort of sedimentary layers that have built up over time, even though in other ways they are siloed and can in fact stand next to each other in dramatically different ways. And that Darryl Cooper piece, where I first found this Bret Weinstein tweet, was sort of writing about that in some ways, that people sort of, if you have no commonality with another human being next to you, you really can't engage with that person. And so sort of what this great story and network of civilization has done is sort of help people, even though they kill each other, even though they differ with each other, even though they war with each other, figure out how to maybe not war and not kill, and figure out how to tolerate and abide at one degree or another within all the politics and trying to get one up on the other at a time, but to try for all of us to know the truth and live in it according to that story that we inhabit, which is another way of talking about what a religion is. And now he's talking about the fact that, well, with AI and aliens and all the kind of stuff that's sort of ramping through today, I'm noticing too that YouTube is getting harder and harder in some ways to find, I think, good content, because so much of what I'm seeing now on YouTube is just sort of slop. It's an AI generated thumbnail, and it's either B-roll or AI generated images, and then sometimes AI generated narration or sometimes a human voice narration. But increasingly, I'm just looking for YouTube channels that actually have someone who I think to a fair degree is not AI generated. And that's Bret, and that's myself, and that's others. I want to know what a real person thinks.
Paralysis. That the number of different combinations of possibilities where you cannot resolve, you cannot get closure and say, I think I live in this world, and so I'm going to ignore all of those possibilities over there and go forward as if this is true. You're basically going to become agnostic about just about everything. And so in this mental multiverse, you will maybe be able to avoid embarrassment by not putting your weight on any of the ice, but you can't accomplish
embarrassment. We're talking death in most cases. I mean, it's a luxury of civilization that the worst we can expect is embarrassment.
anything in that state. And that's what I'm concerned about. We are going to be collectively put into a circumstance where everybody will be afraid to assume enough about the world to actually be capable of acting rationally towards it. And that's a very frightening prospect.
And the glass man is here. I'll pick this up in a minute. It won't seem like any time at all in your little YouTube universe. Glasses measured, we proceed.
Yeah, it is. It's terrifying. And it does point to the need for actual physical interactions with the world and with people, and to work hard to decrease the percentage of the interactions that you have that are mitigated by screens, that could be mitigated by AI, whether or not you know it. That when you are in the physical presence of another organism, be it human or otherwise, that is doing something, at least now, that is not, and your sensory biases exist, and you and I could be watching the same thing and see something different, but what we saw was real if it was, a fox on the ground doing something. And it is not mitigated by AI, whereas nothing coming through the screens at this point. You and I are having this conversation. Jen's in the next room. The three of us know that we're here doing this. Our dog's on the floor behind us, but none of the tens of thousands of people who will listen to or watch this can know with 100% assurance that you and I are actually here doing the thing that we're claiming to do.
Right. Although in this case, there's a lot. This is something of which you can't be as confident as the two of us are here, right. But you can be pretty confident because the number of things that would have to be true for us not to be real is spectacular. But this is going to get less and less true over time.
Yeah. And
I agree with you. One of the clear remedies here is in-person meeting, so that at the point that people's confidence in factual,
and this will probably get more and more evident as we go forward in time,
material craters, that you at least have somewhere to go to where something doesn't need to be established, right? That you know who the other people in the room are.
And that's reducing the combinatorial explosiveness. And, again, it's part of, when I say what is the TLC, it's this. Most of you watching this will know that, some of you won't, but it is having not only an in-person community, but even having a community online where we've had interactions in various ways. We've had interactions on Twitter, we've had interactions on Zoom, we've had interactions on live streams, we've had interaction on Common. We multiply the points of contact, we multiply the domains in which we know each other, and that then reduces the combinatorial explosiveness, increases the trust, so that we can talk about difficult things and learn from each other.
Something about how they think, and maybe collectively you can bootstrap your way out of it. I do think this is one of the reasons that our podcast became so popular at the point that you had us take our private discussions about COVID online, is that I think everybody was suddenly catapulted into a world of total uncertainty about almost everything.
And I think this actually is something helpful about YouTube and other services similar. I just started, this is just for the members because it's so, I don't know. Why would anybody want to watch this? But some of you are nerds and you want to know, I do my rough draft for Sunday on Saturdays. And some of you might want to know some of the stuff that I do in the middle of the week. It's sort of similar to the open studio idea that we had going on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, but I'm just throwing up these videos in the comment section.
Everything. And watching.
Sorry, not the comment section, the membership section, the $3 a month membership section.
People who, frankly, I think would have been kind of hard to fake.
That's us.
Yeah. Reason through things it was like an anchor point, right? And it is, in fact, one of the things that people tell us over and over again when people who we don't know come up to us, you kept us grounded during COVID, right? They often say you kept us sane. And I think there was just something about that doesn't look fake. And
we're not pretending to be experts. We're trying to figure it out.
Right.
just like all of you are, and we bring a particular evolutionary toolkit that most people don't have, but we'd love for everyone to have it, and we bring particular experiences that that happen to mean that we know stuff about science funding and bats and and such that and public health that the so-called experts probably didn't see coming.
Yep. So in person is going to be an absolute key given what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I feel a little bit strange about saying from our starting point, but I wonder, the following thing is true. Amongst the people who we now know well, the people who figured out how to think their way through COVID and found each other and became the movement of COVID dissidents, there is a high degree of religious faith.
There is.
It's interesting. And I always took that to imply.
Now, again, given what he used to say about religion and some of the other videos, I'm not going to go back and play those things, but you can find, if you just search one with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Bret Weinstein, you can basically get his normal take on that. And so part of what has happened is he has updated his filters and said, wait a minute, I've noticed that these crises have a way of sort of accentuating things, and we pay more attention and we learn some things. Our normal filter, that's really in many ways what apocalypse is about. The word apocalypse means revelation. It also has this dual sense, especially in our culture, that apocalypse, partly because of the apocalypse of John, which is the last book of the Bible, has this tearing down, that the idea is that things have to come off of our eyes so that we can see more clearly. And I think part of what happened with them through the COVID situation is they needed a reappraisal of the role of religion in the world, especially given their background in evolutionary biology.
That there's something about the courage that one gets from thinking, well, there's only so much they can do to me down here on Earth, but this matters in some context they can't do anything about. Mm-hmm. If you have that faith, it probably emboldens you to face down what's frankly otherwise very frightening forms of coercion. So that's what I always.
So religion gives people courage, and courage is important. I mean, part of what happens, again, you can look at Ian McGilchrist, part of what has happened in our world, a la the Enlightenment, is we've sort of flattened it and given it over to the emissary. And this sort of broadens it because, well, maybe someone has if you try to imagine, which is a really bad way of imagining, if you try to imagine truth as little bricks or Amazon boxes or just basically these discrete things, that's what truth is. There's these building blocks of facts that we manipulate and process, and that's a bad way to consider truth, given you can go all the way back to Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning, conceive as a place of objects or a form for action. Truth is much more, it contains process with it, I'll say it that much. So you begin to recognize that something like courage, you can have someone with, let's say, a better set of facts, but courage will help another person, in many cases, carry on into the future better.
Took to be the reason that we see so much religious faith in the COVID dissident community. But I'm wondering also if belief in some higher power narrative does not also provide you an anchor point that doesn't change irrespective of how murky the evidence gets. In fact, specifically because it is not an evidentiary question, right?
Yep.
You inherit a belief in something, or you adopt a belief in something, and that something is, by its very design, impervious to.
Yep.
And therefore, as the world of certainty collapses around you, it still leaves you something in which you can be certain, and not something arbitrary, right? If you made up your own God and maintained a belief in it, it wouldn't be useful. In fact, it would mislead you as often as not. But if you take something that has been proven out over the course of thousands of years, then it at least retains some kind of reliable currency. It has a truth value that is maybe not measured in its description of the universe, but it is measured in its utility over very long periods of time.
Yeah, it's tethered to humanity's past, such that not only has it therefore literally stood the test of time, but it has been with real human beings for generation after generation after generation across not just time but also space. And so, I mean, there's both a like, therefore there is reality and value there, but there's the question of, oh my goodness, I don't even know if what we're seeing are real people. Like, well, you know that this thing that you have faith in has been believed by real people whom you will never met because they are in the past, whom you will never meet because they are in the past, but they were real. Of that you can be sure. And there is value there that is unchanging.
Yes, and you can imagine at the point that the mental multiverse crisis is at a fever pitch, right? Where you discover some fundamental elements of what you assume to be correct are incorrect, and you're now trying to refactor everything based on, if I'm 3 universes over from the one I thought I lived in, how does that change the combinatorics of all of the various other things that I'm uncertain about? You can imagine being in that state, and frankly, you and I are non-believing members of this dissident community. I think we're kind of structured to deal with that uncertainty and find a different way through it. But you could imagine that for almost anybody, that having something that you don't have to go back and rethink would be, well, it'd be a godsend.
So they've been migrating on this. And now, in the back of my mind, I may be wrong, but Heather had a little bit more. Her upbringing was not Jewish. Now, we're going to use this word Jewish. This word Jewish is a fraught word because figuring out exactly what we're talking about when we use this word is difficult, and it's getting increasingly fraught. It's getting increasingly fraught in religious realms. Tom Holland likes to talk about Judeans. Now, after the work of Jason Staple, he's really, I think, made me a lot more self-conscious in terms of what the New Testament means when it says Jews and Israel. And I'm just beginning the Gospel of John, and I noticed that the NIV, the NIV, now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and I saw that, thought, So then you go over to the Greek, and the hudaioi, that's all it says in the Greek, but there's sensibility here that when we use this word, what exactly do we mean? And so then the NIV translating committee has that sensibility and says, we want to be more precise because it's pretty clear contextually in the Gospel of John, in this verse, in chapter 1, verse 19, that these are, because then it goes on to say, sent priests and Levites. And so this was the ruling elite in Jerusalem. John the Baptist is doing what he's doing, and they want to make an investigation to figure out what should we think or do about him. And so these words are increasingly sensitive. And one of what I'm going to focus on this video is sort of the strange filters and connections that we have, how we relate to these categories that we see out there in the world. Now, I like starting here with Bret's description of these mental multiverses that we're in, because the truth is that different communities, different nations have sort of these different mental multiverses, and we're aware of this now. If you've ever done any international travel, of course, I've always grown up in a I've for those of you who don't know any of my story, a lot of the people who've been around a while do know, I grew up in a mostly African American church and neighborhood, but within a Christian denomination that was Dutch Calvinist. So they had their little mental multiverse. And the African Americans who came up during the Great Migration, escaping Jim Crow, trying to get jobs in industrial Paterson, New Jersey, they had their little own mental multiverse. And where I grew up in New Jersey, it was just this patchwork of all these different multiverses. And some of the inhabitants were called the Jews. And there was a guy, when I was in college, my summer job back in New Jersey was working in a lumber yard. And there was an old, and it was in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. Fair Lawn had a pretty healthy Jewish community and neighborhood. And one of the old carpenters, a fairly picky carpenter, you sort of knew the carpenters that were really picky about their product, because you'd sit with them as they'd look at every little stick of lumber. And there was one guy named Leon Chase. And what was notable about him, and all the other workers in the lumberyard knew, because on his arm he had the tattoo from the Nazi camp. And he was a boy, and he'd have, you could get him to tell these stories from the camp about hiding in the sawdust. And they were often sort of related to woodworking. But, you know, this particularity. So in New Jersey, I grew up in going to a Christian school that had almost everyone with Dutch last names, all of who went to the same Christian denomination that derived from Dutch immigrants. Where I lived, and the particular church that I went at was mostly African Americans who had their own religious and cultural tradition and experience. And then there were a lot of Italian Catholics that were in the neighborhood as well. And we get to know the Italians, and you get to know the Jews, and you get to know the African Americans and the Puerto Ricans. And then there were the Dutch. And so I grew up with all of those little groups there. And then as I go to Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, then I'm really immersed among the Dutch in a city that had a lot of Dutch in it, that had very strong Dutch influence, which was Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then I go away to the Dominican Republic, and I have to I have to learn 2 new cultural groups plus languages of the Haitians and the Dominicans, and then some Puerto Ricans that were there, and on and on and on and on and on. So I've always lived my life with these mental multiverses next to each other. And then when I come to Sacramento, I add in more Japanese community here, and the Chinese community here, and the Hmong community here. And what is true is that the African American communities in Paterson, New Jersey, and in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and in Sacramento, California, are all quite distinct. A lot of the people who came up to Paterson came from the Carolinas. A lot of the people in Grand Rapids came from different places, and a lot of the people here in California came from Louisiana and Texas. And so you have all of these different groups, and so we have all of these different mental models, and they're living together, often sharing a physical space, but they're still living in sort of different worlds, and you have to figure out how to think about these different worlds. Now, part of what happened when I started making videos was then I began to bump into different people online, and some of these people, like Jacob Federecci over in what I call Jacob's Corner, his channel, which is just Federecci. He has a great name about it. Jacob was sort of one of these connectors who began connecting a number of these people together. And one of the people that Jacob sort of brought in when we had Yosef came through the Vervaeke thing, because his background was cognitive science, and then Yosef and Chezi and Jacob and then, you know, some others from that live in Israel. And so it's like, but we're all living in these different mental models. And then there's the fact that my family, we had 2 ethnicities in the family, Dutch and Frisian. And a lot of you are like, Frisian? That's not a nation state. No, it isn't a nation state, but it is an ethnicity, and it is a people group, and they have their own separate language, and they have their own separate culture, and they have their own painful history in conjunction with the Dutch, who dominate the land that they mostly live in. There's also some over on the other side, East Friesland, which is in Germany. But So my mother's side of the family were Frisians, and my father's side, it was always very weird because some Dutchness there, and then a few years before my father died, we discover that, actually the reason on my father's side of the family, things just weren't anywhere near as clear as they were with the Frisians on my mother's side of the family in Whitensville, Massachusetts, was our Jewish heritage. And we had sort of had whispers of that. My grandfather had once said something to my father in the mid 1940s when my father was still quite young. My father was probably 9 or 10 years old, and my grandfather said something to him like, if we were in Europe, we probably would be in trouble with Hitler. It's like, why? And we discovered that we had Jewish roots. And I'd really love to know more about the roots, because we've actually traced generations back before our last name. And we've got this sort of patronymic system that my ancestors had. And then it was sort of easy to trace us, partly because Ellis Island scrambled my great-grandfather's name in a particular way that makes it so that only descendants of my great-grandfather have exactly the same last name here in the United States. And so we did a little bit more digging and discovered that it was my great-great-grandfather who prompted my great-grandfather to come through, so that my great-great-grandfather and his wife and some of his kids could also come through and settle. And when they came to America, they just settled in amongst the Dutch. And but at the same time, why? What happened? What happened in the Netherlands? Why did we become Christians? How did this work? And now, why should any of this matter to me? Because, truth be told, now for a good number of generations, my father married a woman of Frisian ancestry. His father married a woman of Dutch ancestry. My great-great-grandfather, not sure, but I think his wife was Dutch. And it could be that, in fact, what had happened, why it seemed to be only the thread of my great-great-grandfather came to America, is because he married a Dutch girl too. And so marrying outside their own little silo, their own little multiverse, meant that we went to America and we weren't among the Dutch when Hitler occupied the Netherlands and carted all the Dutch out and killed them at Sobibor and Auschwitz. And I can kind of go back and find the people around the branch that came to America and see when and where they all were killed. And so it's like, and how does this interact then with this post-war consensus? Now, Christian Baxter's conversation with Yosef, I thought, was just a gold mine of a lot of topics that interested me. And so I think maybe first I'm going to play a clip, because maybe we'll kind of go in reverse order in time, at least a little bit initially, because when I look at someone like Bret Weinstein and his brother Eric, who I've had a little bit of conversation with offline with respect to some of these issues. You look at someone like Bret, it's like, well, why is he the way he is? And Bret and Eric both maintain, this gets into this interesting question about religion and propositional truth and confessionalism. Someone mentioned, or Jonathan Peugeot had on Twitter, Curtis Yarvin had a tweet that sort of looks like Curtis Yarvin is maybe exploring orthodoxy now. And I think part of the reason a lot of people, maybe they had some Christian background, but they're going and looking at orthodoxy and looking at Catholicism, is they are looking sort of at they're looking for what to them feels like, and look at my conversation with Jared Henderson, sort of like a pre-Enlightenment religion, where the Enlightenment, what's governing isn't necessarily belief. Now, these two talked about belief a lot, but what's governing is more ritual and tradition and practice. And one of the things that I've noticed about the Orthodox is that a good number of Orthodox converts, then I'll let the priests sort this out with your own flock. A good number of Orthodox converts are quite a bit more, dare I say, liberal with respect to the content of their propositional beliefs with respect to their identity. I think that for many people is a feature, not a bug, of the religion that they're seeking. They'll go to mass, they'll go to liturgy, they'll do the thing, but during the rest of the week they're sort of free to have their thoughts, and they don't necessarily feel terribly governed or hemmed in by their thoughts because they're living procedurally, they're participating in the liturgy and the mass, and whereas with confessional Christianity, it tended to more govern the headspace and the propositions that we're tied to. And I don't think any of this is going away, because the propositional churches were never as free from the procedure or the participation as a lot of the propositionalism insisted it should be. And I think the reverse is the case as well. I think the Orthodox Church is very much going to want to govern many of the thoughts and beliefs of those who identify within it. So I'm going to first drop in this portion where it's nice, because Christian in this conversation begins to note that in terms of the hierarchy of American culture, the hierarchy sort of began to adopt what I'd call a monarchical vision, that the view from nowhere says this, and the view from nowhere says this about what we ought and oughtn't to believe, and the view from nowhere says this about Jews are this, and African Americans are this. And, this became very salient during woke, because a whole bunch of particularities began to have this sense of orthodoxy and an enforced orthodoxy. And Americans don't like enforced orthodoxies. We're sort of a nation of nonconformists that gets going all the way at the beginning. So maybe I'll first drop this initial clip about, in many ways, and I've heard this from other things, in many ways, sort of the post-war consensus, America in some ways sort of became the promised land. And for many people of Jewish culture, Jewish religious participation, and Jewish ancestry, who were fleeing the old world and finding a place that was less confining, and a place that, especially during the post-war consensus, increasingly they could participate in. As the WASP establishment sort of receded, more and more freedoms and access came to Jewish Americans, but the same thing, of course, eventually comes to African Americans and Hispanic Americans. And this is it's very interesting looking at Europe in the 19th century and what they're dealing with. America in the 19th century is really continuing to deal with pluralism, questions of ethnicity, and of course, what was I listening to this morning? I was listening to something from, it's in the stuff that, you look at what, say, Disraeli thought of. Maybe we'll cover that here. Depends on how much time we have, but let's go to the clip.
It was funny because, Jews in China and India didn't experience anti-Semitism. And Jews, right, like Jews who worked with Buddhists on the Silk Road, like generally did a lot better. And even Jews in a lot of the Muslim world did better than in Christian Europe. Christian Europe usually was the worst place to be a Jew. Not always, not every part of history. Some Muslim dynasties were worse. Generally, though, and we can call this, like this, what's that phrase? Not the tragedy of small differences. There's a word here.
Tyranny.
Small differences. What?
Yeah, tyranny of small differences.
There you go. Tyranny of small differences. Maybe to some degree it's that. I think to some degree it's also like Christianity, like Jews play such a big role in the Christian scriptures that even if Christians never met Jews, they had an opinion about Jews. Like the random Brahmin in India who suddenly, like the Jew, like moves into their port and starts trading with them, has like, okay, just another random foreigner, like nothing special, nothing, I'm not going to hate them extra, there's no reason to. Islam's a little bit funky here because there are parts, it's much more mixed in some ways, to some degree, at least historically. Modern Islam is different, but historically, like, it was much more mixed. So it's like, it's hard because on the one hand, the Judeo-Christian kind of advocates want to say, like, these share the same values. Then you'll have someone like Chazi on your channel who'll say, well, actually, like, I can find, like, I share a common frame with the Buddhist, I can share a common frame with the Muslim, and I'm going to share a common frame with a Christian, but it's going to just be on a different basis. Even within that, like I've said, like in each of the Christian denominations that I've learned about being in TLC all these years, like I often will see, like, each of them have one strong thing they share with Judaism that I like about Judaism and them, right? So like liturgy and Eastern Orthodox, canon law and halacha, and for the Catholics, I would say the emphasis on Bible study for the Protestants, right? Like, and we can get even more specific into different denominations of Protestantism here, but like there are common arenas, foundations, containers, things, values, hierarchies and trade-offs that we share with each group. Whether that means like we're somehow closer, I think Christians, I think certainly Protestant, like dispensationalist Christians certainly will like to think that we Jews feel like there's a special relationship with us in Christianity in a way that we don't have with Islam, which like historically or like another group, historically that just wasn't really the case, right? Like Maimonides felt much closer to Islam than he did to Catholics, which were the only other thing. Well, Eastern Orthodox are around too, and he was meeting Copts. But like when he was seeing all those, like it was clear to him the monotheism of Islam, that was the arena that he mattered to him the most. That like they shared that with Judaism and also that iconoclasm, and like that was like a much stronger basis for a bridge. Now, what's a basis for a bridge now is complicated because for all of the issues with the post-war consensus, for Jews, that's what's allowed us to flourish in this country in many ways. Not that Jews weren't here before that, right? But it was really, and I'm not even saying because of the Holocaust. In many ways, because Jews served in World War II alongside a lot of Americans, and they were exposed to Jews more generally. Because and this is something that Kale also talks about, right? This common, like, we all fought together. Forget like who was persecuted. Like that's not even part of that story, at least in the immediate post-war period. It's much more. And Jews are right. They're writing the Superman comics. They're writing Batman. They're writing, right? Like they're creating this. They are creating the vision of Americana of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in a really meaningful way. And we don't even have to like talk about like civil rights and sexual revolution, all the stuff that comes in after, right? Like there's already, and then what happens with Vatican II, which like really helped resets Catholic Jewish relations in a fundamental way, which is something that's like we could never have imagined, like historically. The Protestant denominations, and some of this comes maybe out of guilt, maybe out of that part of the Holocaust post-war consensus. But I also think there's just this general alignment around this liberal vision, right? Of like that's much more allowing for interfaith dialogue and a much more just that there's a lot more room for cooperation here than we've acknowledged in the past. And that's not just, it wasn't just Jews, right? This is why I don't think it's just Holocaust, because we know ecumenical dialogues really kick off in the post-World War II era, right? The Copts in the East, right? The non-Chalcedonian Chalcedonians start really having serious talks again. The Catholics in the Eastern Orthodox sort of begin to have talks again. And a number of Protestant denominations, like the Anglicans, start like reaching out to, let's say, the Eastern Orthodox or whatever. Like there's these new bridges of ecumenism that really start spreading much faster. And it's not unique to Jews. And it's not just like, the Catholic Church and Jews and Eastern Orthodox and Jews still have not really started a proper dialogue. Like, so I don't even know that the post-war consensus ever hit there, with the exception of like Father Stephen DeYoung, who's only an exception because he's American. Like, I don't, it's not that the Eastern Orthodox Church, the ethnic churches in their home countries are doing this. It is this conversation of ecumenism in the Eastern Orthodox Church is really happening in the American or Western, really the American and Canadian context.
Well, it's
And, the mention of Stephen DeYoung, too, there is interesting because not only does he have a Dutch background, but, he's also a New Testament scholar. And so he's interested in, you can't study New Testament now without this intense focus on Second Temple Judaism and all that's come out in terms of who is Paul, understanding him in that context, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is fairly new and fresh. This gets into the post-war consensus stuff because part of what happens during the Second War is that the WASP establishment sort of recedes. Roosevelt is the first to bring Jews into the cabinet, Catholics into the cabinet, and so there's just a whole bunch of elements. They're not all racial, and that's really important in the story because one of the things that you see is that you begin. What we've been seeing for the last couple hundred years is this turn from, let's say, religious bodies to these nation states. It was Roosevelt's America which popularized an indigenous new label for what the Allies were defending, not Christian civilization. So again, I've been working through the First World War, and in the First World War, as the war grinds on, as it becomes increasingly evident, 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, that nobody's winning this war, and in order to keep their own populations from sort of revolting to get out of this war, which is just slaughtering an entire generation, the propaganda and the rhetoric just keeps rising, and both sides are like, this is a fight for Christian civilization, becomes the call. During the Second World War, it becomes Judeo-Christian civilization. And that linking was sort of not even looked at as unusual during, let's say, the height of the post-war consensus. But now that it recedes, people begin to look at that. Under other circumstances, conscripting Judaism into a supporting role in a Christian drama might have been crass. But at this moment, it was an inspired move. It, of course, directly defied Nazis' murderous obsession with Jews and Judaism, and against some trends in liberal Protestant theology, firmly asserted that Christianity had Jewish roots. But it also made it clear that the newly imagined Judeo-Christian civilization was irreducibly plural. It was a broad-based alliance by which, by going forward as to embrace Judaism, it also became obvious that Christians of all kinds would be part of this unified front. It's true that President Roosevelt said in 1942 of two of his staffers, one Catholic and one Jew, that this is a Protestant country and the Catholics and Jews are here under sufferance, but he was joking in his sawtooth way, and they knew it. America, by then fighting for a world of religious freedom, and if America's collective religious imagination as yet only extended to Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism, the point stood. Now, it's important to remember that, again, reading a whole bunch more European 19th century history, the difference between America and Europe is quite stark, and the sense of Westernness is quite stark, because America, you don't have an established church, you have freedom of religion. I would say the conversation with respect to identity and racial identity and nationalism is quite a bit more progressive than, in some ways, what they're struggling with in Europe now with respect to mass immigration. Democracy, America's democratic. Even though all the presidents, most of the presidents are quite waspy, compared to what's happening in terms of Europe. Of course, in the First World War, you have this question of absolutist, old-style, imperial imperial empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire. One of the things that the First World War does is sort of destroys all of that autocracy, and the republics begin to gain more of a foothold. So France, France had still sort of been wobbling between empire and Napoleonic Empire and republic. You have anti-clericalism. So a lot's going on in Europe. But in America, especially once America gets into the First World War and Wilson comes over, and Wilson's going to make demands at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, you can really see American influence begin to pick up. And of course, after the Second World War, American influence is really going to be strong in Western Europe. In wartime, these were more than slogans. In February 1943, the American troop ship Dorchester was torpedoed off the Canadian coast. 4 military chaplains, 2 Protestants, 1 Catholic, and a Jew were aboard. According to the accounts given by the survivors, they worked together to hurry men into the lifeboats. They distributed life jackets, and when the life jackets ran out, they gave their own to 4 young sailors. They then joined hands, singing and praying together as the ship sank. Reportedly, all 4 of them reciting the Shema, the Jewish affirmation of God's oneness, as the waters took them. As their story was told, the 4 chaplains rapidly became symbols of America united for Judeo-Christian civilization against its godless foe. They were celebrated from a commemorative postage stamp through a marble memorial in Michigan to an interfaith chapel in Philadelphia, later dedicated by President Truman himself. The moral case that this was a war for Judeo-Christian civilization, and especially for that very deliberate inclusion of Judaism, turned out to be stronger than almost anyone in the West expected. It was, of course, universally known that Nazi Germany persecuted Jews and sent them to concentration camps. Wartime propaganda made a certain amount of mileage out of this, but of course, after the war, things grow and grow and grow along this.
Multi-denominational. So we had Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionists, and Jews that were not affiliated with any of the movements.
Can you give a brief rundown of the kind of differences? I mean,
yeah. So it's hard. It would basically be the equivalent of going to a Christian school where it's still Christian, but like there are people from all denominations there, including like Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, right? Like it's something that really would span the board. Now we don't have that many denominations, so like it's a lot different in Judaism in some sense, and like our denominations don't kill each other or don't have a history of doing so. So it's like a little different. Like we can have a school in one. Generally, like Philly is a decent sized community, but like outside of the really big Jewish communities of LA, New York, Chicago, and Miami, a lot of the smaller communities like don't have enough people to like really support Jewish day schools like that are like single denominations in full. Now Philly does now have a Orthodox high school. Sorry, I shouldn't say this. I should qualify this because you wanted me to talk about the denominations for a second. For a long time, I think the best way to think about how Judaism sort of looked like was the way somewhat Eastern Orthodoxy looks like, where there is, you're kind of just defined by your region, right? So like if you're a Jew from Eastern Europe, you're an Ashkenazi Jew, or Central and Eastern Europe. If you were from the Mediterranean, you were Sephardi, like the Mediterranean basin, basically. If you were from North Africa, deeper in than just like the coast, you were Maghrebi, and then Mizrahi were sort of everyone who are like in the Levant and into Iraq and Persia and even into China and India. So there were kind of like these regions, but then the Jews in Western Europe like experienced the Protestant Reformation to some degree, I mean, indirectly, but there was a group that wanted to modernize Judaism, especially kind of in light of Enlightenment ideas and anticipation of Jewish emancipation. So Jews were beginning to get to the right to be citizens of countries as countries became less based on religion. And they were very particularly inspired by Reformed Christianity, so they called themselves Reformed Judaism. And Reformed Judaism, classically, the German Reformed Judaism, looked a lot like Lutheranism in some sense. I mean, that's what they were trying to assimilate to. So they restructured the architecture of their synagogues, and they changed the sermon to be to German as opposed to Yiddish or whatever their local language they were using before was. They wanted to start using pipe organs, which became a very big contentious issue. Traditionally, Jews did not use any musical instruments on the Sabbath, so like using any instrument is like a very big departure. There were groups of them that wanted to start holding services on Sundays, in fact, which is like particularly crazy. But they were like, if you're going to be modern and fit to the modern work week, and you have to remember this is before the weekend was invented, the day off that everyone had was Sunday. So like there was both economic, but also social pressure to really this was a very assimilationist movement to some degree, from my perspective, right? They also felt that a lot of this stuff, and this is very TLC related, so we should talk about it for a second. They were like, hey, we have all this symbolism, all these myths, all the stuff that Joe talks about. But we know really why this stuff is there. We understand, like, there's logic to this. We've created a system that like basically not just systematizes this, but like says like we can extract the abstract principles from all of this stuff. And we don't really need this primitive like myth anymore. We don't really need all of these commandments anymore because we know what the commandments are trying to instill in us. So they had this very kind of leap in their own, they had a high faith in their own ability to understand, and a very high opinion of what the mind could do, not necessarily embodied stuff, right? But just we can just think about these things and do them in the abstract and like just teach our kids these principles.
Yeah, and hold on to them.
Yes, and and in doing so, they started saying we don't need this commandment, that commandment. They wanted to only keep commandments that were sort of aligned with not just Christianity, but specifically like Enlightenment, like the secularized liberal, like not liberal yet, but secularized Christian kind of post-Christian values as they were seeing them, right? In the 1800s. This, of course, then generated like backlash, right? So there were people within the Reform movement who were saying, you guys are going too far. And they broke off and called themselves the conservative movement, even though they're not as conservative in the sense of conserving or preserving as Orthodox Judaism. They were like, you can't go that far. So they kind of backtracked. Or not backtracked, but they were like, here and no further. Maybe is a better way to say
that? Those modernizing or reformational Jews, what are they known as today?
So Reform Judaism still exists.
Okay.
Now there are different versions of it. There's a more classical reform, which did not, for instance, they were like, Germany is our country. We no longer will mention the temple or Israel in our prayers, right? Like they really would not have been, forget like political Zionism. They wouldn't have been like Zionists even like in the most cultural like sense in their day. Modern reform is Zionist. So like that was a major shift for them. Modern reform also like uses a lot more Hebrew than classical reform. Classical reform wanted to basically get rid of as much Hebrew as possible. So there was a number of shifts since then where reform, I think, has become less extreme, but there are still some holdouts, and there's some weird corner cases actually still in Europe, amazingly, of like in Hungary, they're still like, I can't remember what they're called. They don't call themselves reform there, but they're kind of these neoliberal, I think maybe it's the term they use, Jews there.
But then you have.
So I wasn't. My parents were.
Your parents were. I know your parents were. I guess you were raised that way.
So I wasn't. I was actually raised Orthodox.
Okay.
Yeah. So I will. Yeah. So I won't go into all the other denominations, but I should at least define a little bit of orthodoxy probably, which is useful. So even before conservatives started, once reform started, and reform really like made itself a denomination, right? It had a platform. It had like a group of rabbis formally got together and signed a document, right? Like, not exactly a confession, but like Judaism does not have those things traditionally. Like we have nothing like what a Christian denomination has, especially Protestant Christian denominations. Reform imported this model. The first reaction before even the conservative movement broke off was what they were called neo-Orthodox at the time. And the neo-Orthodox was a German rabbi who was traditional, but felt like he needed to respond to this reform thing much more strongly. His name was Rabbi Hirsch, and Samson Raphael Hirsch, and he and there's a number of other people with him, but he's usually considered the founder of this movement, and he opposed a lot of these changes, but he also felt like these changes were happening because of an education crisis and a meaning crisis that was happening in 19th century Germany, and that should not be ignored. I mean, we have to understand, like, Napoleon comes in. Napoleon recreates a Sanhedrin when he's in France. He reconvenes, right? So there has not been a Sanhedrin, had not been one. Well, there had been an attempt at recreating one in the 15th century or in the 16th century, but there had not really been a functional one since the church basically dismantled it in the 4th century or so, 5th century. So like it had been a very long time since we had a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the governing central counselor body of Judaism, right? It was the only such body we had. Ever since then, like there are no levels of rabbis in some sense. There we don't have an ecclesiastical structure. Every rabbi is just kind of a local authority over their community. They can form organizations, but like there's no one over your rabbi necessarily. And we don't like have a synod or anything like this, whatever. Now I know those exist because of Paul. Like we just don't have such things because we don't have denominations that need to like update platforms, and like none of that happened until Reform Judaism. When Neo-Orthodoxy responded, they didn't necessarily create like a full-on denomination, but they created a much more articulated position that had to address modernity. It couldn't just ignore it anymore. And it specifically was very focused on education and on what he was viewing as an assimilation crisis, because even though Napoleon created the Sanhedrin, his goal was that Jews would be French citizens. Up till that point, Jews were not generally citizens of any countries in the sense of full rights of citizenship. If you wanted to vote, you had to, or like be in the army, or own weapons even sometimes, or own land, depending on the country, you had to convert to Christianity. Right? That was it. Jews were kind of in their own autonomous structured bubbles. And every country was a little bit different in how they managed those bubbles. And the Protestant countries, that was changing much more rapidly in some ways. I mean, Jews in England and in the Netherlands, at least, maybe not Germany, but the Netherlands really were seeing like some gains. But yeah, there's generally the move was toward assimilation, and that was and the rabbis were aware that that would mean that more like Jews could much more easily leave Judaism, and that could be like a real problem because Christianity incentivized many ways basically to leave Judaism, because if you wanted to be
citizenship,
the business connections, the social networks, like anything,
right.
Unless you happen to be a very particular unless you happen to be in the very particular niche of a court Jew, which was this kind of pre-existing position of a very, very few Jews had in the early modern period, where they sort of were the go-betweens between the Jewish community and the state, but they could also they could wield some power, but they were always like at the discretion. It wasn't a feudal system, but it was sort of, right. It was patronage essentially. So like you wanted to, so often, for instance, in Poland, there are lots of Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for instance. The Polish were very, very welcoming of Jews when they were trying to create their country in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. It was also like, it was they voted. I mean, it wasn't everyone. The aristocracy of Poland voted for their king, right? Like it was actually some sort of weird democracy of some sort. It had a constitution. And they invited lots of Jews to come especially after the Jews got kicked out of Spain by the Catholics, and all the territories that were held by the Catholic monarchs of Spain. So yeah, lots of Jews went there, and like Jews generally could not do some things, but they were given more rights there than other countries already, and that included especially being able to have liquor licenses. And that meant that Jews basically ran all of the inns in Poland for a very long time. And so if you see like Polish literature, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, the Jew owns the tavern or the inn, like almost always. That meant we had a weird place there that was very different than other parts of Europe, right? So as opposed to thinking about the Jew as the money lender, Jew as like the tax farmer, like there are other models, but there, in part because of wealth was kind of ingrained in the way you preserved grain was in alcohol, and Jews had extensive ability to create trade networks across large regions. Like in some ways, alcohol was a natural kind of fit for us there in that region. That worked out well until there were like temperance movements to some degree, right? Like, and then they're like, oh, the Jews are evil because like they get everyone to drink. Now, luckily, Eastern Europe usually isn't a big place for temperance, but there were certainly sometimes tensions around this. And so, sorry, I speak in footnotes, as someone told me at South Estuary.
What's that? Speak in footnotes? Is that what you said?
I speak in footnotes. We keep going down these like rabbit holes.
Like, yes, on page 65.
Yeah, but the real point of this was just he, in response to the dismissal of symbolism by the Reform movement, Samson Raphael Hirsch basically puts out a new commentary in German on the 5 books of the Torah that is a symbolic commentary. And he specifically, even though it's somewhat influenced by Kabbalah, he specifically doesn't want it to be mystical because he doesn't want to start like getting into those issues of like, there are, especially from the people who are deep in the disenchantment enlightenment movement, like the thing they're going to distrust most is kind of esoteric mysticism. So he doesn't necessarily want to go there, but he does want to give like strong symbolic explanations of the text, pedagogic explanations of the text. In many ways, like he is doing, like I see him as a very kind of an early iteration of Jordan Peterson in some sense, right? Like, and he's to some degree even influenced by psychology because the Hasidic movement is very psychologizing, and he's getting some of his symbolism through that.
Yeah, in my conversation with Hezi, like his dad was a psychologist.
Yes,
and that was kind of like the deep connection to Peterson in a certain way, and so obviously you have the traditions in America with Freud, and then there's Jung, and there's these, and then, so like you said, this is kind of a proto-Petersonian experience within Judaism in a way.
Yeah, so Judaism made a psychological turn around the 1780s or so. And what's really interesting is that Jung, late in his life, discovers Hasidic writings from a century and a half earlier and says, whoa, like they were on, like especially the book of Tanya, like he was like, this is what I'm trying to talk about. So he, there's some interesting and kind of weird, obviously Jung is not Jewish, like lots of differences, major differences, and his alchemy and like a lot of crazy stuff in Jung. But at some level, a lot of the stuff around shadow work and like that has a lot of parallels to Hasidic thought, and a lot of just the archetypes and approaching like the text in this way was very, there was a natural resonance there. And of course, psychology does have, a lot of the founders of psychology are Jewish. And that's not, why is a good question. And there's a good video that actually came out recently on a different channel on like some theories as to why this is, but probably not because of Hasidism, because the people who went into psychology who are Jewish were not religious, so
Yes,
they were most certainly not getting it through that path.
Yeah.
But there are some theories that are sort of plausible as to like why this makes sense. So anyway, that's a side point. So he writes a symbolic commentary, and we go through this whole thing over like whether symbolism matters, whether embodiment matters, whether this like works, whether you can really divide a public secular sphere and still have private religion. All these debates have happened already. In some to me, there's a heavy resonance, but also fascination with like seeing the same debates happening again now, but like 150, 200 years later, in our own culture and society, within Christianity mostly to some degree. So I'm not seeing these debates really re-happening in Judaism. Like we've seen these debates and we're sort of past them on a new iteration to some degree. Not that we aren't also like dealing with all the other things happening in the culture right now, but like you're not seeing a big re-enchantment in Judaism at the moment because that's already sort of happened. Yeah, in fact, we already have been through 2 waves of re-enchantment, I would say. We might be in a third one right now to some degree in Orthodox Judaism, weirdly enough. There's like the Neo-Hasidic movement in Orthodox Judaism, which is confusing because there are parts of Orthodox Judaism that became very rational. Maimonides was, even though he's 12th century, he was heavily rationalist, or at least the way that he was often read. Not everyone read him this way. A lot of people read him very rationalist, very much in the vein of Aquinas, Aristotelianism, not Platonic. Or there are new readings of him that are more Neoplatonic, or like try to see more of a balance there. But there were Jews who basically who maintained their orthodoxy, but still were able to be heavily rationalists because they saw Maimonides as their role model, right? And that's how they confronted modernity, saying like, he clearly was right, and like we're just going to get full on behind him. And they tended to be very hardline against the mystic, esoteric, like Kabbalah traditions, and that has had some reversal, I guess, in the past 15, 20 years that I would call it re-enchantment to some degree.
Our culture becoming less secular and atheist, ultimately more spiritual as a baseline.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say he wasn't spiritual. I mean, this is like this.
I guess I'm just using that word as kind of to connect to the.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't understand demons as real entities, right? For him, they were certainly metaphoric, right? He would have probably recognized egregores under a different name. Angels for him were the spheres, right? Like, so there weren't beings they weren't personages.
Yes.
So fine. But at the same time, like Judaism is not going to have, like there's no fairy world. Like even the equivalent of George MacDonald in Judaism, there is one, Rav Nachman of Breslov, who lived at the same time, but in Ukraine. Like he's writing fantasy that is like heavily symbolic. He's a Hasidic rabbi, but telling fantasy stories, and like there are not monsters and fairies in them, right? They're going to be kings and princes and talking animals and like those things, but like we don't have that level of I don't know if we call that enchantment, or you just want to call that like a very specific brand within kind of the fantasy realm.
Yeah.
I thought this section that I just played was super interesting. Now we go a little bit further back in time and we look at how Jews who are living in Europe, well, they're starting to come increasingly into the mainstream. But as, let's say, either imperial definitions or more so religious definitions. For example, if you read Sleepwalkers, Christopher Clark's book about the beginnings of the First World War, you can really sense all of the layers that are going on in that period. So Serbia and its great backer, Russia, is Orthodox, but if I remember correctly, Bosnia-Herzegovina, are they Catholic? And then others are Muslim. And so you have this Balkan area, which is this tremendously difficult patchwork of these tiny little groups that overlap and they intermingle. And of course, these vast ancient style empires could sort of contain these groups, but there was there wasn't necessarily something like equality. The groups were understood to be different. There were different rules for the groups, and Yosef mentioned this back, with some of the different Islamic groups. But of course, the Islam and what we call Judaism, they both are monotheistic, and so they're sort of separated from the Christians by Trinitarian ideas, and so there's just this extraordinarily complex patchwork. And part of what, for a long time I've talked about secularism as this really sneaky way for a certain kind of Christian civilization and even Christian imperialism to sort of rework some of the ancient struggles around pluralism. So if you go all the way back to, let's say, the classical period or late antiquity, polytheism is a way to sort of manage pluralism. And now, so you can just sort of continue to add gods, and some gods will sort of recede into the background, of course, Christianity and its monotheism that it inherits from Jesus. Christianity is sort of this split off. And again, back to the Bret Weinstein tweet, Christianity is sort of this split off. And there are, on those little videos that I made, there's a lot of different things going on. Let's say New Testament scholars look at the relationship, let's say, between John the Baptist and the Qumran community. And then how, let's say, Pauline theology with respect to apocalyptic narratives is in contrast with some of the apocalyptic narratives that are in the Qumran community. And there's a lot of what we call apocalyptic. And I think that's something that, especially in this age, as we continue to sort of figure out when we're having apocalyptic feelings, okay, well, how exactly is that governing our imagination? And how are we using language? And how are we using symbolism? And I thought it was really interesting when Yosef was talking about this sort of you've got symbolism and symbolic thinking on one hand, and then what words are we going to use to contrast that? Sort of rationalistic, or is it emissarian in sort of a Ian McGilchrist way? How exactly are we going to sort of contrast these two? Because again, with respect to the symbolism and what we, you might say, use scientific or positivistic, different kinds of frame, how in fact are we using language to make sense of the world? Again, back to Bret Weinstein, sort of these mental multiverses that we're living in. And part of what's happened is that we've had these different communities, the different cultural silos and containers that of course have they have liminal spaces between them, but things are sort of passing back and forth. But yet, part of the amazing thing about the continuity of let's say, the ecology of Jewish communities is that, they've survived centuries with an identity, but that identity has continued to morph, and that's where the conversation with Yosef was so interesting. Let's see, I wonder if I had included that with some of the other, part of what had happened with respect when Christians discover Jews, they think, and I am certainly guilty of this in many respects, because the only frame of reference I have is all of the talk that we've been doing in terms of our imaginative structures of who the Jews were when we read them in the Bible, all within our own particular theological tradition. So if you're, let's say, Reformed like I am, the reformational categories from Luther and Calvin really control a lot of these ideas. And so one of the things that was done, let's say, sort of in the reformational period, you say, well, I remember one Orthodox Presbyterian OPC pastor in Southern California in the church of a friend of mine down there that I was visiting. I don't remember why I was down there. For one reason, he said, oh, well, you know, the Vietnamese and the Vietnamese are, you know, they're often become Catholic because they both worship statues. Oh. So like the Buddhists and the Catholics are the same because they both worship statues. Okay, and I know a bunch of my Catholic friends are freaking out right now. Hold on, because it's going to get worse. And, well, you see, the Jews and the Catholics, what they have in common is they're both legalists, whereas we Calvinists and Lutherans are free from the law. And so you have all of these, especially because you learn your doctrine and your dogma when you're young, and so you're given these fairly large, low-resolution, simplistic categories whereby, well, Catholic and Jews, the Catholics are semi-Pelagian, and the Jews are just legalists because of the Pharisees. And so, but of course, there's just all of these filters that you're reading through, and part of what happens as you get a theological education, as you continue to read and work through passages every year and continue to read updates and scholarship and all of these conversations, is that these low resolution categories sort of break down. That leads to a lot of this pluralism. It's corrupting our pastors, or it's corrupting our people, because things used to be simple. Jews and Catholics are the same because they both live by works, but we Calvinists live by grace, and Lutherans too. So there, you Catholics and Jews, because you're all the same. And Catholics and Jews are like, we're all the same. The history of relationships between Catholics and Jews, well, this is all complicated. And so, of course, as Yosef mentioned, and, you know, delightful conversation between Dave Busatil and Sam Tiedemann too, it was really interesting when Dave Busatil basically tells Sam, you know, I see all these people going to Orthodox and Catholicism. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm not gonna stop there. I'm gonna go all the way back to Old Testament times, and you know, we sort of practice the Seder because that's Old Testament times. And someone like Yosef comes in and says, if you go to a synagogue today and get to know some people, and they invite you into some of their participatory frames, and if you think that's coming straight from Exodus, well, you've just imported a whole bunch of very Protestant filters. And because you might be a restorationist. And you might imagine, well, aren't they just doing what Moses told them to do? And Yosef is like, there's all these layers. Because not only have Christians been going through all of these layers and breaks and having all of this history going through time, doing exactly how I critique Bret Weinstein, that no, religious communities are constantly updating their frameworks and their metrics. But there's a tremendous amount of pluralism in there. And so if you get invited to a Jewish household to participate in something, don't just assume that they're a bunch of Protestant, biblicist, reconstructionists saying, I mean, I can pull books off from the 1960s in the Christian Reformed Church where first we have Jesus, then we have the apostles, and then we really have the Apostle Paul, our favorite apostle, and then we have the Reformation. Well, what happened between the Apostle Paul and the Reformation? Lots of bad stuff. So we finally, in the Reformation, got back to the Apostle Paul and read him right. And I know I'm triggering a bunch of people anyway, but so be it. But my point is that there's all of this stuff that goes on in between. And so, you know, the fact that we, again, the David Busatil, Sam Tiedemann conversation was wonderful. And the corner is wonderful because, like Cyprus, well, Paul and Barnabas on Cyprus. And then there's, we have our upcycle, our Harris from Cyprus, and we have Dave Busatil from Malta. But of course, they all got here like the weird way that I sometimes think, well, how does that word Jewish relate to me? Now, a lot of people would say it doesn't at all because it's through your father's line, and so you've had all these Dutch women, so you're not Jewish at all. I don't know. I don't know how this works, but I don't think any of us know how any of this works because all of us are sitting atop all of these sedimentary layers of reproduction, of culture, of change, of history. And so when you get Bret Weinstein talking about code, well, that's a nice imaginative way of getting at it. So I was just churning all through the stuff, thought, I got to go back to this one book because I didn't get that far in it. And the reason I didn't get that far in it is because most of the time when I get a book from Audible, it's got a great reader and the voice is wonderful. But I'm going to express my misogyny right now. I prefer male readers of Audible books. I just do. I like a big, heavy male voice reading my book to me. And this particular book has a woman that reads it, and I just don't like her voice. And so I kind of crapped out on the book, even though I really liked the book. And once I announce the book, I know it'll be controversial. But why start avoiding controversy? So the book is Paul Johnson's A History of the Jews. Now, Paul Johnson, for a previous generation, was sort of the Tom Holland. He's not an academic historian. He writes popular history. And, if you're going to write a book, A History of the Jews, well, it's going to be a big one because they've got a lot of history and you got to go over a lot of it pretty quickly. But I don't know a lot of it. And so for me, you need to start somewhere. And of course, you've got all of this difficult history and complex history of Jews in Europe. And then the Enlightenment begins to change some things. In Europe, the Enlightenment brought them hopes which proved illusions and opportunities which turned into a new set of problems. In some areas, the rule of reason did not operate at all. By three partitions of Poland, 1772, 1793, 1795, the Russian Empire, which hitherto refused to admit Jews at all, acquired 1 million of them as a result of its territorial greed. It now gave them rights of residence only within a pale of settlement, where their numbers, poverty, disabilities, and all increased rapidly. In Italy, too, at any rate in the Papal States, the position of the Jews also deteriorated under anti-Semitic Pope Pius VI, 1775 to 99, whose edict on the Jews, published right at the start of his long reign, led directly to forced baptisms. Jews were obliged by law to listen to contemptuous and insulting sermons, and if a sort of baptismal ceremony had been performed over a Jewish child, perhaps in a secret by a Catholic maidservant, the church would claim possession later. That gets into all kinds of trouble on down the line. And of course, you have this patchwork of nations, and it's going to be different in many places, but the transformation of, let's say, and this of course leads to all kinds of contemporary biases, anti-clericalism, animosity against religion that you'll find in historic atheism and, let's say, new atheism. And because, well, when churches rule, they discriminate about, let's say, the thinkings that you have in your head. They're the thought police, and that's sort of a pushback against, obviously, confessionalism. But, of course, Christianity is far older than Protestant reformational conceptions of confessionalism, which had to deal, or an attempt to deal with the pluralism within within the Protestant Reformation and within Protestant and Catholic dogma. So there's all kinds of things going on. The ambivalence was by no means wholly resolved by the outbreak of the French Revolution. In theory, the revolution was to make all men, including Jews, equal. In return, Jews must abandon any separatism. So right now, you're beginning to get a trade-off. It's like, okay, you know what? No more special taxes, no more ghettos, no more special rules. We're going to have an open society, and if you've got the wrong last name or haven't been baptized, and again, if you were a Jew in France up until the French Revolution, you were in no way French because your Frenchness came to you by your baptism in the church. And of course, after the Huguenots, may that be a Catholic baptism. Nevertheless, the deed was done. French Jews were now free, and the clock could never be turned back completely. Moreover, emancipation in some form took place. I'd never seen emancipation used for this. When I thought of emancipation, I always thought of African American slaves. And so this is where you have this dual history of sort of dealing with it in the Americas on one hand and dealing with it in Europe. And I was far more familiar with American history. Moreover, emancipation in some form took place wherever the French were able to carry the revolutionary spirit in their arms. The ghettos and the Jewish quarters were broken into papal Avignon, Nice, and the Rhineland. The spread of the revolution to the Netherlands and the founding of the Batavian Republic led to Jews being guaranteed full and formal rights by law in 1796. In 1796 to 98, Napoleon Bonaparte liberated many of the Italian ghettos, French troops, young Jews, and local enthusiasts tearing down the crumbling old walls with their bare hands. Now, of course, there's a lot more history. But it's going to, again, be complicated because life is always complicated. Jews sensibly declined to identify their interest with French imperialism. English Jews were rightly worried about the wave of xenophobia which the Revolutionary Terror inspired and which produced the Aliens Act of 1793. The wardens of the Portuguese synagogue in London ordered the rabbi to preach a sermon insisting on the duty of Jews to show their devotion to king and constitution. Rabbi Solomon Herschel's Thanksgiving sermon on the victory of Trafalgar was the first time from the Great Synagogue to be published. It breathed, wrote the Gentleman's Magazine, a strain of true piety, great loyalty, and universal benevolence. So again, even before Judeo-Christian America happens in the Roosevelt administration, in Imperial England, well, you'd better know what side your bread is buttered on. And of course, any immigrant group learns this. It was during the First World War that Christian Reformed churches first start using English in their services because a church in Hull, Iowa got burned down because Dutch and Deutsch are too darn close together and we look too much like the Germans. And anti-German sentiment during the First World War was very hot. And so suddenly you find Christian Reformed churches that never really sort of thought themselves as American anyway. We just lived here for our own convenience and hopefully to flourish and have our religious freedom. Suddenly we're festooning our churches with American flags and all the Yankee Dutch are trying to speak English as best that they could. At the other end of Europe and Russia, the Hasidim did not want French-style enlightenment and riches. As one rabbi said, if Bonaparte wins, the wealthy among Israel will increase and the riches of Israel will be raised, but they would leave and take the heart of Israel far from the Father in heaven. See, and so even within religious communities, you're going to have a really complex history. The Jews were abundantly justified in viewing radical attitudes to them with grave suspicion. There was a worm in the apple which the revolutionary goddess proffered them. The events of 1789 were a product of the French Enlightenment, which was strongly anti-clerical and, at bottom, hostile to religion as such. This posed a problem. Much was permitted to clever writers of the 18th century France, but direct attacks on the Catholic Church were dangerous. So part of what that means is that they're anti-clerical, they're anti-religion, and so, well, what's been preserving Jewish identity and Jewish culture? It's everything that to the French and to everyone else looks religious. And in Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary, 1756, Voltaire argued that it was absurd for modern European society to take its fundamental laws and beliefs from the Jews. Their residence in Babylon and Alexandria, which allowed individuals to acquire wisdom and knowledge, only trained the people as a whole in the art of usury. They're a totally ignorant nation who for many years have combined contemptible miserliness and the most revolting superstition with a violent hatred of all those nations which have tolerated them. That's Voltaire. So, in other words, is the Enlightenment really going to be your friend? Now, of course, what's going to happen is that, well, as the barriers go down, more and more, probably like my ancestors, decide, do I really want to do all the synagogue stuff, or would it just be better to be sort of a secular Dutch? And I might even go over to the Reformed Church and get my kids baptized. One of the things that I caught in the conversation with Yosef was Napoleon basically started a new council for the Jews. The idea was to create a permanent relationship between the new state and the Jews on the lines of those Napoleon had already concluded with the Catholics and the Protestants. The 111-strong body elected by Jewish community leaders met from July 1806 to April 1807 and provided answers to 12 questions the authorities put to it concerning marriage laws, Jewish attitudes to the state, internal organization, and usury. On the basis of these answers, Napoleon replaced the old communal organization, with what were termed consistories, as a part of the general Jewish statutes, which regulated the conduct of those now seen not as Jews, but as French citizens of Mosaic faith. Boy, that sounds pretty thing. Eventually, it was dubbed a Sanhedrin. On 31 July 1817, a precocious 12-year-old boy, Benjamin Disraeli, was baptized into the Anglican Church at St. Andrews, Holborn, by the Reverend Mr. Timothy Thimbleby. This was the culmination of a quarrel between the boy's father, Isaac Disraeli, and the Bevis Marks Synagogue, an important point of Jewish principle. In Judaism, as we have noted, service to the community was not an option or a privilege, but an obligation. In 1813, the well-to-do Mr. Disraeli had been elected a warden or parnas, in strict accordance with the laws of the Bevis Marks congregation. He was indignant. He had always paid his dues and considered himself a Jew. Indeed, as an antiquarian author, he had actually written an essay called The Genius of Judaism. But his major work, by contrast, the 5-volume Life of King Charles the Martyr, he had a low opinion both of Judaism and the Jews. In his book Curiosities of Literature, 1791, he had described the Talmud as a complete system of the barbarous learnings of the Jews. Now, this is Mr. Disraeli, father of the man who would be the prime minister. He thought the Jews had no men of genius or talent to lose. I can count all the men of genius on my fingers. 10 centuries have not produced great men. He baptizes his son, Benjamin Disraeli, who will become prime minister. Another famous baptism, 7 years later, after Disraeli's baptism on 26 August 1824, a similar event took place in the German town of Trier, this time involving the 6-year-old Karl Hendrik Marx, as he is now renamed. His family apostasy was more serious. Marx's grandfather was a rabbi in Trier until his death in 1789. His uncle was still the rabbi. His mother came from a long line of famous rabbis and scholars, going back to Meyer Kotzelbogen, a 16th century rector of the Talmudic College of Padua. But Marx's father, Heinrich, was the child of the Enlightenment, a student of Voltaire and Rousseau. He was also an ambitious lawyer. Trier was now in Prussia, where Jews were emancipated since the Edict of 11 March 1812. In theory, it was still in force, despite Napoleon's defeat. In reality, it was evaded. Thus, Jews could train in law, but not practice it. So Heinrich Marx became a Christian and in due course rose to be the dean of Trier Bar. Karl Marx, instead of going to the yeshiva, attended Trier High School, then in charge of a headmaster, later sacked for his liberalism. His baptism proved to be more significant to the world than Disraeli's. Conversion to Christianity was one way in which Jews reached an age of emancipation. Traditionally, baptism had been an escape from persecution, and emancipation should have made it unnecessary. In fact, from the end of the 18th century, it became more common. And he goes into quite a bit of this history in terms of how this works out. And then he goes into the Rothschilds. I'm sure Grim Grizz has detailed notes on the Rothschilds. But you see this movement through time, and you see how the sedimentary layers just continue to build until we get the amazing things like this Maltese, who is a Protestant Christian with a real fascination for Jewish roots. That he doesn't possess any biologically, but he certainly possesses them ecclesiastically. And Sam, our Unitarian, who focuses more on the church fathers, trying to get at a more authentic understanding of the relationship between God the Father and his son Jesus. And then all the way to Bret Weinstein. Maybe I'll jump to the tweet itself. The New Testament is a major revision of an ancient cultural operating system. The updated code is fundamental to the modern West, which inevitably crashes without it. Some who have retained the trappings, you say Judeo-Christian West. Some who have retained the trappings of the prior version of the OS have quietly accepted the fundamentals of the operating system. There's a lot going on here. He continues with another one. Let's address a couple of inevitable. Question 1. Why can't you just say this in plain English? This is as simple as I'm currently capable of accurately making it. It requires some work to understand, but it's 4 paragraphs that, if you can figure them out, will change how you understand yourself, human history, and place in it. I don't think it quite landed that payload in me, but I think it's tremendously interesting how this is all going. Now, it's interesting because let's say that Bret and Heather decided they wanted to go to church. Where would they go? Because in many ways, the church is just this massive puzzle. Because part of what we've seen is that, a good number have, say, gone to Orthodoxy. And many who have gone to Orthodoxy, let's say, okay, so here's a question. If, so John Vervaeke, he's talked about the fact that for a while he of course left a fundamentalist Protestant community. For a while, it sounds like he was in the mainline, which is sort of its own theological tradition now. And the mainline, they might often have good liturgy. They have pretty buildings. They're not policing, let's say, confessional boundaries or sexuality, but they have their own dogmas that have seemed to have arisen in many mainline churches, at least among the clergy. Ryan Burge has done a lot of pieces about how far more liberal the clergy of the mainline is from even many of the people in the pews. Could John Vervaeke go Orthodox? He certainly likes Bishop Maximus, the monk. He's impressed with him. But what would orthodoxy mean for John Vervaeke? Because again, on one hand, maybe procedurally, perspectively, participatorily, can't get that word out. But one of the interesting things, and I loved how Yosef talked about, people, let's say, from a Protestant place that might be even downstream confessional, it's funny because even if you get to the Stone Campbell revival churches, they're sort of anti-confessional, but confessionality, participation, procedure, it always just comes in. You're never going to escape all these 4 P's of knowing. They all, and then plus other ones that we haven't necessarily named. You're not going to escape it, and because these things will come up. So where would John Vervaeke go to church? Where would Bret and Heather go to church? Would they go to, maybe they'd go to a Catholic church if she has some Catholic roots. Or maybe Bret would decide to, I mean, and again, listening to Yosef could probably go to some Jewish ceremonies, but everything's on the table these days, which is the point of this mental multiverse. And the question is, can you actually construct a community of your mental multiverse when there's just so many layers going on? Or does it have to be sort of, I'm going to go in this place, I'm going to do these ceremonies, but then suddenly, does the symbolic gain traction? Does it catch? Are we going to be able to come together and act publicly as a body acts within other large bodies? Leave a comment.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. The ghost with the Messiah complex. A Messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. The hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad. Daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us, baptized in ball pits, a clown served the sacrament we eat, more Pepsi and Pizza Hut, say please, say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers. See what I say. Just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. You think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried in a fading dream.
Well, I don't know about the meaning crisis, left, right, black, white, or other vices, which Jesus Christ is right, or if we're all saved. From my perspective, our propositions participate procedurally, running in circles. We're in body, we're in the age of decay. Symbolically speaking, the reapers are reaping, them damn egregores are whispering sweetly. We're all NPCs in the belly of the beast. Red pill, blue pill, bread pill, Mars Hill, or DMT, or whatever you feel. Got one and number two, it's all the same damn thing. So clean your room, repent on Zoom, ontology for dummies, a bird's eye view. 'Cause if you really knew, could you really even say? Totally depraved, all totally saved, a total disposition from the bed we all made. Or is it the elect, or are we just insane? From John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson to the Chris Pacou Show, Paul Vanderklays and Griswold Grimm and all the dice he shakes. This estuary ditty is a little bit cringy, ain't quite the U-shaped or the hero's journey. All the NPCs in the flood treading water to watch you save the day with a bunch of chitter-chatter. From the ortho bros to the Catholic Joes, or atheistic Jobs, to Protestant folks, the Joe Schmoes, and Jewish Jacobs, and everything in between. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your own. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and with all your mind and your fingers and toes, all your neighbors too, as if they were your